Hello and welcome to the Writing for Academic Publication webinar series hosted by the Graduate Writing Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. My name is Catherine Chang-Stahl and I am the facilitator for this webinar. In this particular webinar, we will be talking about this idea of dealing with manuscript rejection. This is a topic that doesn't get explored much. In fact, there isn't a lot of space for just holding all the emotions and all of the thoughts when it comes to having your work be rejected by a journal, by a book editor, etc. So just like with all the other webinar videos, this is not a how-to for dealing with manuscript rejection. This is more of a how we have dealt with manuscript rejection. This entire webinar series was based on student experiences. This topic was something requested by all of you. And we thought it would be important to not only provide a peek behind the scenes of what happens, but also holding some space for what is not spoken about, which is this idea of rejection, which is often associated with failure, not being good enough, and all of the negative emotions that we associate with not getting something. And so this particular video is really meant as nourishing your soul in some ways. It's hopefully going to provide you with some comfort, knowing that rejection, even though it's rarely spoken about, is a very normal part of academic publishing. It's a very normal part of being a student. It's a very normal part of life. But again, there aren't many places and spaces for dealing with the less pleasant aspects of writing for academic publication. So again, hopefully this will be a space where you have some of your other needs met. I wanted to start with some words from the Graduate Writing Center team, hopefully helping us have a more healthy relationship with rejection by normalizing rejection. So here's something that we have discussed as a team. Everyone gets rejected. The more you submit, the more rejections you get. Even if you get rejected, the feedback will be valuable in improving your writing for the next submission. So a couple of ideas here. One is that rejections are inevitable. So the more that you put yourself out there, yes, there's a greater likelihood of you having your work published, but it also means a greater reality of having your work be rejected by others. And even though rejection is often framed very negatively, when it comes to having your work rejected, it also means that you'll be getting feedback for how to make your writing stronger for the next round, because your writing is constantly evolving, and just because it hasn't found a home in one place doesn't mean that it won't find a home in another place. So we had started off the webinar series about finding a home, finding a good fit for your writing. And I think it's important to return to this idea of finding a home, because sometimes we have to move homes in order to find a place for our writing to reside. This is a slide that you've probably seen, or you've learned about this in one place or another. So there are two possible kinds of rejections, at least for the initial submission. One where your work is rejected at the desk by one of the editors. This means that before your work gets sent out for review by the editorial team or a team of peer reviewers, the editor or editors decided that your work is not a good fit and they decide to reject. So that's called a desk reject. The other kind of rejection happens after peer review. The editors will compile the feedback and make an executive decision, and sometimes it's that the work in its current form is not publishable. Here is a sample desk reject that I've had the opportunity to experience. This is the actual wording. Obviously, I've removed the author's names. This was a collaborative piece. It goes, "Hi, blank, I am rejecting your article, but I will send you some comments on the piece via email because I think it has potential. Best, signed, journal editor." So this was a rather quick and seemingly painless rejection letter, very direct. "I am rejecting your article." There is no sugarcoating of it. What I did appreciate, though, is that despite this article being rejected, we were able to receive some helpful comments from this particular journal editor for how to rework our ideas or how to focus our ideas for a stronger revision. But of course, this editor decided that even with revisions, our piece would not be a good fit. So we are now in the process of finding it a different home. Here I am compiling a bunch of reasons, potential reasons for why a manuscript might have been rejected. I am taking this directly from Dr. Felicia Menza from her recent book from 2020. I've sort of reorganized her original list to put them in certain clusters that I feel like could be helpful for us to think about the key reasons. So in the first box in pink, these are some of the broader, bigger issues with the manuscript. Things like the claims that you're making in your manuscript are not well supported by the data that you have gathered, that you have generated, and that you have presented as part of your writing. So there's some kind of disconnect between the conclusions that you are drawing and the data that you are showcasing. Likewise, this idea that the discussion that follows does not match the findings that you're presenting. So once again, there is some kind of gap in how you are connecting the findings, the data, and the implications of the data. Sometimes the rejection has to do with your findings and claims being overly generalized, not specific enough, not saying something clearly, very vague, or just inaccurate. It might be also that your discussion of the findings and the significance is limited, that it's not well fleshed out. Similar to findings being not generalizable, sometimes journals are looking for implications that are either theoretical or practical, depending on the audience. And if they find that your findings are not doing that, then they might question the significance. They might question the overall contribution of your piece. Of course, not all findings are meant to be generalizable, right? Like some studies are focused more on the particulars of lived experiences and are not trying to say anything about general populations. But it's important to be explicit about that and perhaps name it as a limitation that because of your sample size or because of your aim, this is not something that you are pursuing. And so part of the rejection might involve just thinking more clearly about what it is that you're saying and what it is that you're not saying. So having those boundaries marked for yourself. And sometimes we don't even realize it until we get the feedback. And finally, similar to kind of issues with the discussion and findings, this idea that nothing new is presented, there is no originality. I think something I want to say about this, and this is feedback that I gotten from other professors and advisors, is that no research is fully original, right? Like no research occurs in a vacuum. No writing occurs in a vacuum. We're always in conversation with others. We're constantly learning from others, building on the work of others, challenging others' ideas, questioning others' ideas. So to have something truly fully original, I think that's overstated. But you do want to think about your contribution, about what it is that you have to say. And there should be something new or novel or different or significant or meaningful or valuable about what it is that you're putting out there. So a comment like nothing new is presented, no originality, take that with a grain of salt, but also sit with that idea of what is it that you want to say and offer to a given community. The next set of reasons have to do with data collection, or overall design of your research. So it has less to do with the writing itself and more with the way that you conceptualize your study. So perhaps the editors or the peer reviewers identify certain limitations with the design itself. Perhaps there are issues with your methodological approach, with the specific procedure that you use for data generation or data collection. Perhaps there isn't enough information around how you conducted your analysis. Perhaps given the research questions you're asking, they felt that there was not enough data collected to support it. Perhaps the type of data didn't really align with the question itself. Maybe they're seeking more details for the method so that they can actually follow what was happening. Maybe that section is written vaguely, or perhaps it's not even provided. Another big issue has to do with research questions not being explicitly identified. All right, and part of that might be you didn't state it very clearly. You know what your questions are, but maybe they were not articulated in a manner to be received by the readers. The next 3 bullet points have to do with theory, conceptual frameworks, theoretical frameworks. So maybe your use of theory was deemed improper or insufficient. Maybe you didn't really have or write about a theoretical or conceptual framework from which your work is approaching or how it's situated. Perhaps you have too many theories happening, being drawn upon, and they are not working well in tandem. Maybe they are not applied appropriately. Again, all of this is very subjective, so you would have to read more into the comments themselves, but a common rejection reason has to do with the lack or insufficient or improper use of theory as deemed by the reviewers and the editors. Then, of course, there is an issue of alignment, that the manuscript you're submitting doesn't quite fit the mission and the audience, the scope, the vision of the journal. And this has nothing to do with you, your writing, your project. It just means that people are in different scholarly circles, and your piece might fit better in a different community with a different audience. So again, it's all about fit. It's not necessarily about how good your research is, how good your writing is. All of that is very subjective anyways. Related to fit has to do with following guidelines. Perhaps the guidelines were not followed as closely. Maybe you went over the word count. Maybe there are certain sections that you were supposed to include that you didn't include. There could be many reasons relating to the guidelines. So in general, it can be helpful to create a checklist from the author guidelines so that you know exactly what you need to include in your manuscript. The other 2 bullet points have to do with the literature review and sort of just being part of a scholarly community and behaving appropriately and being ethical in your writing. So perhaps you are not acknowledging the works of others. You are plagiarizing or not even realizing that you are writing about things that are big ideas contributed by others. So this might mean you need to go back and just refresh your memory, or be sure to think about who came before you and acknowledging the ideas of others that you are building on. Related to that might be a literature review that is outdated. Maybe it doesn't show that you are engaged with most current and timely scholarship in your area. So this would be an opportunity for you to dive deeper into what is happening in your field, what's the landscape, and doing that reading so you can do that writing. The final section has to do with the writing itself. So the manuscript preparation. Maybe you have a manuscript that is considered too short and not enough developed ideas are being presented. Or the opposite, your manuscript is way too long. You are exceeding the word count and you are presenting more than enough ideas, and perhaps they are too scattered, not focused enough. This was something that my co-author and I actually was very intentional about, was thinking about what are the key ideas we want to present in this particular article, knowing that there's so much we can write about, but what are the 3 key themes we hope to focus on? And we landed on the number 3, just from past experience of my co-author, but also what was emerging from the data. So there are different ways you go about the writing, but sometimes having too many ideas that are not well developed can be a point for rejection. Perhaps the writing itself was difficult to follow because there was not good flow, or perhaps the organization takes away from the argument. Maybe the manuscript, again, was not well developed, it was not well structured. You have good ideas, but they're not presented in a way that shows the connections between data, findings, research questions, etc. Your ideas and concepts might not be well explained, especially key concepts that are the building blocks for your argument. This is a small one, but it can really add up, I guess. Grammatical and spelling errors throughout your manuscript that have not been corrected. Sometimes this might be a pet peeve for one of the reviewers or one of the editors. And so it's important to maybe have someone look it over, or it could be helpful to hire a copy editor to ensure that your manuscript is polished in terms of the writing and the spelling. Sometimes a piece doesn't get accepted because there's just too much jargon, too much language that takes away from the ideas, language that's not explained, language that's esoteric. Perhaps you're using too many acronyms and it's just distracting, right? Visually, but also conceptually distracting when there's just so much going on that isn't well explained. Related to the writing itself, writing can also take place multimodally in the form of the tables, graphs, images, and figures that would include. Perhaps these are not presented well. Maybe there are too many, not enough. Maybe they're too small. The resolution is poor. They're not easily visible. Maybe there are copyright issues. So those could also be other reasons for rejections. So I like to come back to this idea of finding the right fit, or finding another home for your writing, knowing that there's a home out there for you, but it's a matter of finding it. And I wanted to share these words of wisdom from Dr. Esther Hojito. She is from my program, and these words were shared to me by another member of my program, someone that I very much admire, Dr. Katie Newhouse. And she shared this: all a rejected article means is you need to find it another home. And I haven't submitted enough articles to really have a whole lot of experience with rejection. I've already been rejected for sure, but I haven't experienced enough to really sit with rejection. But I wanted to offer this because I know that rejection is inevitable and will come. And I just find this framing to be really healthy and helpful for students and early career scholars alike. This idea that a rejection doesn't say anything about you, doesn't say anything about your writing and your ideas, things that we often will internalize because it just hurts, right? But instead, Dr. Ojito is saying a rejected article means that it needs a different home. It needs to be in conversation somewhere else. It needs a different audience. It needs a different community to be part of. And I think that's really important because we are all in our niche communities. There are people that we feel like there's good chemistry with, and there are others that we just don't really interact with. And it doesn't say anything much about us, but the fact that there's just not the right connection. And so there are so many journals out there, there's so many books out there, there's so many places that can house your writing, house your ideas. And it just might require us to do our due diligence to seek out these homes and other homes for our writing. And so I'd like to end this webinar with something a little bit lighter. I recently came across the CV of failures on Twitter. I am not sure who came up with this idea originally, but this individual, Johannes Haushofer, had posted their CV of failures, and I just really appreciated it because, again, it helps to normalize rejection, it helps to normalize failure, and it helps us not internalize it as something to do with us as individuals, as students, but just something that happens the more that we put ourselves out there, because not everyone agrees with our tastes, our ideas. So this is a CV. You can see the degree programs, you can see the academic journals, the funding, typical sections that you find in a resume or a CV. But instead of listing the acceptances, which commonly goes into a CV, right? Like all of our accomplishments, all the things that we won, all the things that we got praised for, this CV is highlighting and foregrounding all the ways that we have so-called failed. And not only is this humorous, but I just find it nourishing for the soul, because I think we can all relate to this to some extent. There are probably programs that we really wanted to get into that didn't take us, that there were rejections from journals, from conferences, funding that we applied for that we didn't get. And again, these are things that happen to us but don't get spoken about, or maybe there just hasn't been much space for this, and maybe it's just not part of how we move in the academy. But it can be really healthy to have this kind of CV alongside the CV that we're used to seeing. And so I've never written a CV like this for myself, but I feel like I want to, because rejection or not, it's a learning experience. And if we can see rejection as a way for us to just get to know ourselves better and to clarify our purpose and our vision and what matters to us, I think it can be a really powerful thing to experience as well, or at least very generative. And so that ends this webinar. I know the pacing of this and the tone and the ethos of this was probably a little bit different, but I hope that this particular webinar complements the other ones in terms of just pausing a little bit and holding space for things that are not spoken much about in our journeys as students navigating academic publishing. Thank you for joining me.